Welcome. I'm Langdon Hammer. It is a Wednesday morning in July 2014. We are here in the fourth floor, the deck of James Merrill's apartment at 107 Water Street. And I am going to have a conversation with his longtime friend, J.D. McClatchy. Sandy, you always called him Jimmy.
I think I called him Jimmy because that's what he called himself, as it were. He signed himself even that way.
Yeah.
But it was just at a point in his life when he was preferring that new acquaintances call him James.
Yeah.
I think that happens to many people. Their familiar name begins to seem either overly familiar or too childish, and they prefer the dignity of the full name.
Yeah, somehow it seems to characterize the tone of your friendship.
Yes, I think it did. It had that kind of easy familiarity to it that was. When I would hear other people call him James, he suddenly seemed like a slightly different person.
Yeah. Well, we're here in his home, and it's a home that you started visiting, I think, in
Yes.
the mid-1970s.
Yes.
Take me through a dinner party at James Merrill's house. What would that be like? Who might be there? How did it unfold?
Well, there were probably two kinds of dinner parties, one a winter party, one a summer party. Winter parties had to be inside, therefore at his dining table, which could only seat 4 or 5, or could squeeze maybe 6 thin people around it. In the summer, he could eat up here at a fold-down table and accommodate a couple of more. So, and of course, in the summer too, there were many more people coming through town and many more people visiting. A cozier winter dinner would almost invariably include the Stone women, that is to say Grace Stone and her daughter Eleanor Perenni, who became good friends when I moved here. Grace was in her 90s, Eleanor in her 60s. Both of them writers, both of them strong-minded, and they had learned a kind of toughness with Jimmy by playing bridge with him. Jimmy, strange enough, although the stakes were pennies, he was a very ferocious bridge player. And when I was 2 or 3 times his partner, you could tell that he was angry at me for making a dumb move or the wrong bid. He took that very much more seriously than he did many other things. He fancied himself a good cook. I think by good he meant inventive, which often meant what clever thing can I do with 4-day-old leftovers in the fridge? Some people swear, I remember John Bernard Myers, the art dealer and an old friend of Jimmy, swears that he was poisoned twice by, I don't know what, month-old shrimp or something like that. But he would like to make sauerbraten, for example, or some sauced thing that would tend to disguise whatever was underneath it, salad. And he prided himself on a kind of elaborate desserts. The first time I had dinner with him, here there were just the two of us, and he made, I had never had one, a dessert souffle, which I thought was very exotic. I'd never had such a thing. And the dinner parties moved smoothly. He was somebody, probably me, would help clear the table and bring new dishes on and pour wine. But he had everybody laughing at the table because he was so witty. But much of those dinners involved neighborhood gossip. It's village life. And so the main topic of interest is who is sleeping with whom, how much did she get in the divorce, and so on. Like dinner tables all across the country. I don't remember, no, nothing was ever mentioned, high art or anything like that. Once I was here with Paul Manette, I think it was just the 3 of us, and Paul was eager to bring up, each person was to name his favorite book. And that was about as intellectual as it got.
And that was Paul's
Or
idea.
poems, yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, somebody mentioned Dante, somebody mentioned Milton, and Jimmy said Letty's Globe by Charles Tennyson, a minor sonnet and a funny one, but he wouldn't let himself be trapped into a kind of ponderous intellectual discussion, ever. And so he liked also going out to dinner. He never wanted to go to restaurants. He really disliked restaurants. But he liked being invited to his friend's house. And so when I eventually bought a house in Stonington, about 4 or 5 blocks from here, he was over, whenever he was in town, he was over for dinner. And who doesn't like to have his dinner made for him? But he would, and by say, the late 80s, he'd stopped drinking altogether to help his health along. But I do remember evenings towards the end at my house, just the two of us, when I would have poured myself a delicious glass of red wine to have with dinner, and there was a glass of water in front of Jimmy. He would lean over and just stick his little finger into my glass of wine like that, and just like that, just for a taste of what the good old stuff was.
Now, let's see, we've jumped forward in time, maybe 20 years,
Yeah.
close to 20 years.
Yeah.
Maybe we should start back at the beginning.
Yeah.
How did you meet?
I met Jimmy the way most people do, and everyone should. That is to say, I met him first through his work. I had seen a poem in the New Yorker, Up and Down. It was published shortly before the book it's in, Braving the Elements, was published in 1972. I was just completely enchanted by this poem. I hadn't read much Merrill before. I was not a regular reader of, say, the New Yorker. And the book came out soon after. I bought a copy of the book and was sitting on the staircase at Yale in Lindsley Chittenden Hall waiting
You
for...
were a graduate student.
I was a graduate student at Yale and waiting for a class to begin and looking at this book, paging through it. And suddenly I could hear the sound, didn't hear it very often at Yale, high heels coming down the marble staircase behind me. And it was Marie Boroff, a professor at Yale of Anglo-Saxon. And I had noticed on the back of the book, among the reviews of previous books, was one by Marie Boroff. I said, "Oh, Miss Boroff, look, your name is here on the back of this book." And she stared down to see what book it was. And she said, "Oh, James Merrill, you're going to like him, his work a lot." Well, I did. As to the extent that I then wrote a fan letter to Jimmy, just addressed in care of his publisher, Athenaeum in New York. And I can't remember how banal that was, but what would you expect at that age? Months went by before a blue air letter came back to me from Athens, to which my letter had been forwarded by the publisher. Jimmy was there in his house in Greece, and he wrote back a very nice letter. Thank you for your, blah, blah, blah. And it would have ended there, but I had found that same week, by coincidence, at an old book barn outside of New Haven, a long leather, but shaped rectangular diary of a young American woman on her first trip to Europe, and she was writing up everything. And I read through it carefully, and it turned out that she had been at the first performance of Traviata. And she writes about, she doesn't know what it is, and she remembered that outside her balcony the next day, citizens were swarming, singing tunes from Traviata and whatnot. I sent this to Jimmy in Athens, thinking he'd be amused by this figure of the kind of silly young girl who, exposed to a great masterpiece, has no idea what she's seen and yet still feels the effect of it all around her. And he wrote back then, and he loved it. He loved it, and that made more. And so he wrote a second letter back to me, and there were a couple more back and forth until finally he said, "I'm giving a reading next April with Elizabeth Bishop at the 92nd Street Y in New York. Why don't you come to that? We could meet." I did. I'm not sure that I'd heard much about Elizabeth Bishop at that point. But I went to the reading. She read first. She then came into the audience, into the front row from backstage, in order to hear Jimmy read. It was a big contrast. Elizabeth a kind of dull reader, and Jimmy probably the best reader of anything that anyone has ever heard, really spectacular performer. And she thought so too and listened to him. So I was eager to get backstage to meet him, but my mother had taught me to be polite to the people who were in the way to the person you really want to meet. So I went up to Miss Bishop, who was standing in the first row, and I said, "Thank you very much, Miss Bishop," or something like that. And she just looked imperiously at me and pointed to the stage and said, "Go get my watch," which she had left on the lectern while she was reading to time herself. I climbed up on stage, got her watch, returned it to her, noted she never said thank you, and thought, well, that's the end of that. And went to by this time, so much time had passed that everybody was in the reception area. And I spotted Jimmy with a crowd around him, and it seemed that he was trying to light a cigarette. And every time he went to do that, somebody else would put the book in front of him, Braving the Elements at this time, for him to sign it. And he just couldn't get the cigarette lit. So everybody smoked in those days, so I took out my trusty Bic lighter and shoved my hand through the 3 or 4 rings of people around him, lit the thing. He had a cigarette, and he lit the cigarette finally, and he looked up with such gratitude to whoever it was. And I just said over the few people, I said, "Hi, I'm Sandy McClatchy." And he said, "Oh, you're Sandy McClatchy, blah, blah, blah." And later that night, he said, "Well, why don't you come up? Would you like to come up for dinner one night?" As a Mingy graduate student at Yale, I was delighted to get out of town and came up. He sent me a postcard with instructions of how to find the house. And even minor postcards like that were filled with, it said, you'll drive along Water Street and you'll come upon my house at the corner of this and that. And it used to be painted a pale aubergine, but is now the color of leg makeup. He couldn't describe a mere color. But, we just hit it off right from the start. I don't know why. He didn't know too many students or people of that generation. His friends were always older, and particularly in village types. So I was invited back, several times. Once I would stay in the little guest room on the other side of the hall from here. One night the Stone ladies were supposed to be there, and Grace was not feeling well, and she didn't go. And I went to bed, and there was a broadside of a poem, I can't remember the name of it, 1939 or something like that, is dedicated to Grace. And Jimmy had written at the bottom, "In lieu of Grace, here's her, a poem about her," because you couldn't find her at all. So that's how we met. And then by a couple of years later, he said, "Would you like to use my house in the summer while I'm away in Greece?" And I said, "Sure." And started coming up here while he was gone. And it really became kind of second home for me. And I spent a good bit of time here. And then when he was away in the winter, he would say, "Just use it whenever you want." And I did. It was a place where I fell in love and fell out of love. I would come up here, heaving when somebody had broken up with me, and I felt the solitude, winter solitude of Stonington somehow consoling because it matched my own feelings. And I remember the first time I've only had 3 or 4 boyfriends in my life. I brought the first one up here to a dinner with the ladies. He was a pianist and not a very impressive person. It didn't seem that way at the time, but it was pretty clear soon on. And the ladies were very suspicious. They had gotten very fond of me, so anybody who was in my life, they would look down their nose at. And till finally, we were sitting right here. I was sitting over there, and the ladies, as a kind of challenge, said to Paul, the young man, and said, "Suppose I want to hear you play the piano." So instead of getting up to play a Schumann something, he said, "Well, why don't any one of you just give me a song that you like, and I'll play variations on it, improvise." Silence, nobody could think of anything. Or they were trying to think of the hardest thing that they could recommend, and to try to trip him up. So finally Grace said, "Oh, Greensleeves." Not a difficult choice. And Paul went to the piano back here and just played this miraculous set of variations on Greensleeve just off the top of his head. the ladies were impressed. Suddenly, Paul is included in the conversation. And he goes over, it was a way up here that you had to prove you were talented to be included in dinner parties and everything else.
Well, that's the tough audience of the
Yes.
Stone women, but was that true for Jimmy?
He already had proven himself.
Well, what I meant was that did one have to gain admission?
Yes, I think so, in a way. He had lower standards probably than the Stone women. But yes, I think so. I mean, a lot of people came through his lives, and he was always initially interested in everyone and would find out what he could about the person. But if the person was a kind of hanger-on or of less interest than others, he would find a way to just politely disengage. But he had more patience than many people would with the newcomer. The stranger always seemed to have something to offer, some glimpse of something.
It reminds me of his interest in novels and people novels. His interest in character. But you mentioned opera, and I want to ask you about that. You brought already an interest in opera yourself,
Right.
When you became friends. But over your lifetime, opera's become absolutely central to your life, and it was very important to him. Tell us what opera meant for James Merrill.
Let me say one thing first. That first dinner I came up here, I thought I should bring a gift. And knowing, by gossip that he was the man who had everything, I thought, So I went to the local record store and I said, what is the most erudite piece recording you have right now? And the salesman picked up on that very quickly, and he said, well, I have this new recording of songs by Duparc. Who? I said, Henri Duparc, the great French songwriter. I said, I'd never heard of him. But I said, fine, I'll take that. That sounded so obscure. And I brought it up to him, and I gave it to him, and he seemed very pleased and whatnot. And then after dinner, we must have sat in the living room to have finish the wine. And he said, so you're fond of Duparc? And finally, I'd had enough wine to speak the truth, and I said, well, frankly, I'd never heard of him before. You don't know Fidele, his great song? No. He said, I'll play it for you right now. And he puts on the recording. I think it was Janet Baker or someone like singing. It was just heart-ravishing. It was so beautiful. And it became one of those things where the gift you pick for him becomes an education for yourself in a way. And that was not untypical of him at all. Opera. We had that in common. I had listened, as he had, to the Met Saturday broadcasts, since when I was a kid. His first opera to go to, I think, was Madame Butterfly, still a favorite of mine and of everyone's. And he had opera lessons, I think. Did he have a music teacher who would give him? They were very assiduous about, educating the young boy, and he was taken to the opera often. And we would go together later on to things at the Met with great pleasure. I think he said that Rosenkavalier was his favorite of all operas. But he loved Puccini, he loved Wagner, and Verdi, so there was very little that he didn't like. I remember sitting next to him at a performance at Glimmerglass. It was a rather fateful day. Glimmerglass opera, they were doing Manon no, they were doing Werther, of Massenet. And one of the scenes, Werther was writing endless letters to Charlotte. And in this production, just sheets of paper were pouring out of somewhere, all connected, a big tangle to approximate the emotional connection between them. And I remember Jimmy leaning over and saying, his fax machine must be out of order. Those days, faxes came out as big sheets of paper. He'd always have a witty remark, because he was always in something and enjoying something, but removed from it at the same time to comment on. But, most opera buffs are that way. It seemed, unlike I played lots of piano music, and he himself played on this piano every day that he was here. Slow movements of Haydn sonatas or nothing very tricky, Chopin, mazurka. But he, I think, even more than piano music, opera was another world entirely, a musical world in which you leave the world of human beings and speech and enter into some kind of magic kingdom, as it were. And I think he loved that experience of giving himself over entirely to some fantastic melodrama inside a strange world.
Even everyone, no one believing, everyone thrilled.
Yeah.
That's the line, isn't it?
Yeah.
From Matt.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it did generate some of his very best poems, and you can see. I mean, I suppose you could say that the last couple of books of the Sandover trilogy seem like a giant. I mean, they're pageant-like, but they could almost seem opera-like in the given play of the dramatic developments.
We haven't actually talked much about poetry, and. Tell me what was so arresting about Up and Down when you opened it on the stairs of the English department.
I think, of course, I liked the second part, the down part, best. I love the narrative of that and the rhythm of that going into the vault with his mother. That seemed wonderful at a technical level and at a narrative too. It was just beautifully handled. But the other half of the poem, I could get the gist of it, but I couldn't follow it. And that intrigued me as much as the part that I could follow. It was easier to go down than to go up, but both parts of the journey were interesting to me. And the book that came out that I sat there on the stairs with was, in many ways, the most difficult book, I think, that he ever wrote. Very knotty and coded and very difficult to unravel, and that simply thrilled me. I was used to poems by Tennyson or Wordsworth, I had never met anybody who, in a wonderful way, pushed you back from the poem, daring you. Can you figure this thing out? You knew that it could be figured out, but it took a long time to do that, and that kind of like an English crossword puzzle. It takes you a long time to figure this out, and that I found both challenging and delicious at the same time. So I was attracted to the more difficult and mysterious side of him first. I think later poems became much more, would you say, accessible or open in their manner, and I love them as well, but I still go back to poems like, in Syrinx or some of those poems that are very hard, but...
Yeah. Perhaps we could take a moment to read a poem.
Ah.
Talk about it. Something...
Something difficult.
Something set here, perhaps, in this house, or...
Well, I don't know where this is set.
Yeah.
Suppose just a short one of the kimono.
Yeah.
James had several kimonos in his closet that he had brought back from Japan early on, and when he was gone, I used to like to wear one, for breakfast, getting up and whatnot, but they seemed too grand to have a weak cup of coffee in, so I didn't. This is a spectacularly beautiful love poem, The Kimono. When I returned from Lover's Lane, my hair was white as snow. Joy, incomprehension, pain, I'd seen like seasons come and go. How I got home again, frozen half dead, perhaps you know. You hide a smile and quote a text. Desires ungratified persist from one life to the next. Hearths we strip ourselves beside, long, long ago, were X'd on blueprints of consuming pride. Times out of mind, the bubble gleam to our charred level drew April back, a sudden beam. Keep talking while I change into the pattern of a stream, bordered with rushes, white on blue. It has all of the, when I returned from Lebanon, my hair was white as snow. It has all of the appeal of a nursery. Mary had a little lamb, his fleece was white as snow. And yet, he likes the traditional and instinctively familiar sound of a poem, form of a poem, and yet what goes on in that, the strange metamorphosis at the end, which is just so extraordinary as he puts on the kimono and becomes what pattern is on the cloth.
And it's a moment where from casual speech and some relationship enters. Yeah. Where he's, yeah.
But again, am I sure exactly of what that situation is? No. Was he? Maybe. Could have been a real situation. It didn't matter. It could have been generated by a moment. But out of it, he makes a kind of grander, more jeweled myth, I suppose, than just what might have happened in life.
You mentioned Jimmy's interest in kimono. Reminds me of his interest in Japan, which is a motif in his work. What was that about?
Well, I never was there with him, and I don't know. I've read what you have read on his accounts of things. There are many little things that he had brought back. His close friend Donald Ritchie was, I think, essentially his connection with Japan, since David had lived there all of his adult life since the war, certainly Donald Ritchie. And Jimmy would see him here in the States, and then when he went to Japan. I think the sheer foreignness of it all. It's not unlike his interest in New Mexico or parts of the world that seem so unfamiliar.
Madame Butterfly.
There you go.
The opera, the world. Yeah.
And I think also Japan is a culture defined by courtesies and strange customs that he loved, I think. Again, it was the manner of the country, the way things, they don't have a word for no, I think, in Japanese. That they have to find ways of expressing themselves that are what we would almost call metaphorical. And I think to live in a culture like that would be fascinating for him as an observer to see that at work.
As you're talking, it's occurred to me that we've spoken about the house here, about Stonington, about characters in Jimmy's life. You haven't mentioned David Jackson.
David I met not the first few times. He was somewhere else, maybe still in Greece. When we eventually met up here, he was very jolly, I think, and the ladies up here, the local gossip was always that people in town here preferred David. They thought he could dance, he could play cards, he could tell stories. He was much preferred. Jimmy seemed a little remote, and though they recognized his talent, they preferred David's company. That, by the time I met him, that had worn thin, I must say. You could see the toll that alcohol and cigarettes had taken on David, and
this is mid-70s.
Yeah, even then, and then if you spent a little more time, you would see how they would rub up against one another as people. Jimmy could be as impatient with David as David could be with him. In the end, tolerant and forgiving, but not happy with David's listless life. I watched them do the Ouija board together, but you could see there was a way that Ouija board, even at the Ouija board, David did not seem totally engaged in things. He would hold, his skin had fallen on his face, and he would sort of hold up his skin like that, and it didn't seem that he was paying much attention to things. Eventually you could see that he wasn't really following conversations. He would go through, hello, how are you, what's new, sort of thing. But he didn't seem much interested. And then towards the end, after all, I knew David longer than Jimmy, because he lived for several years afterwards, and he just had retreated into an empty world of his own, with watching television, smoking. David never really got anything in his get anywhere with his career, and I can't imagine how difficult it was to live with someone so productive and brilliant as Jimmy. That could not have been easy, as it couldn't have been for Chester Coleman and Auden. You know, just wake up next to a great genius who's, you know, just yesterday finished another book. Can't be happy.
When you were describing Jimmy's mild annoyance at you playing bridge when you missed a trick,
Right.
I was thinking what it must have been like for David to be his partner, not
Yes.
only in bridge but in life.
Yeah, Jimmy liked a kind of precision and a kind of aptitude, you know, and he suffered fools graciously, but not for long, without finally getting a little impatient. And he could snap at somebody in the kindest way. David obviously was the recipient of most of that, and that was a shame. On the other hand, in the early days, he loved to have people, friends from Stonington, over for dinner, people who meant nothing to me or to anyone else. He loved all of that, and David was fascinated by Stonington life. So they had that in common, and they had neighbors and friends here in town whom just the pleasure of talking with one another was enough.
You mentioned the Ouija board. You mentioned watching.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us about that. Tell us about that experience.
It was exactly as described in the book. Questions were asked, and the cup would move uncannily around. Jimmy would take down letter by letter. Sometimes he would anticipate what the word was going to be and was wrong, and the cup would slide quickly to no, and they would start again. After all those years, I think he had gotten used to parsing the letters into words more easily than he could at the beginning when they were just coming as a rush, and he would have to go after the fact and divide them up into words. So it was, I never saw any of the great sessions. I think most of that was all done in Athens in any case. But I do remember, I think I was staying here the summer they were being dictated to, and Jimmy would send me 50-page sections of the poem. And I felt like, you know, somebody on the dock in Philadelphia waiting for the next chapter of the Dickens novel to come in. It was very exciting to read it that way, literally not knowing how many pages were left, what was going to happen, the way you could discover it in a book. Here it came again like letters. There was a lot of that between us. And then it was extraordinary. I'd never seen him do this. When he came back in the wintertime, he really isolated himself here to work this up into a poem. He had he first had, you know, decided what the dictée was. Then he would type all these things up, and then he would go through with a yellow liner to the parts that he thought were interesting. And then he would sit down and, you know, sort of panning for gold out of all those things and put the poem together, using what was dictated to him, but sometimes changing it slightly to fit, you know, a metrical pattern. And the one summer, winter, he worked up here in town. He never went out. He barely picked up the telephone. He was working so intensely. I'd never seen him like this before because he was a very sociable person. It's fine to work from 6 in the morning until 5 at night when you'd like to have a drink with a friend and dinner and, you know, a joke. No, that whole winter he had isolated himself. And the only time I spoke with him, he called to tell me that his mademoiselle had died. The character who had raised him and had been very much a presence in famous poems of his. And he burst down in tears at the thought that she had died, and just weeping on the phone. And then went back to work. So there were, you never quite knew how and when these poems were written, because he always seemed available and happy to do things, go sailing or take a walk. And when was all this stuff done? I suspect early in the morning, most of it, before the rest of us had woken up.
You were friends for over 20 years. You began, as you described, with idolizing him, kind of forcing your way into his presence.
Well,
With
I
a big lighter.
suppose.
With a big lighter.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. How did your friendship change? That's a long period.
A long period.
And I think you must have grown a great deal deeper and more complex.
I don't think he would have kept the friendship if he didn't feel that,
Yeah.
and I felt that as well. Yeah, he would visit me in New York or in Vermont, where I was living at the time, and at other places. I would visit him in Key West and stay for periods of time. I never stayed with him. There probably wasn't room, but I would rent someplace nearby. And we found we just had so many things in common. I got him to come and teach at Yale for a semester. He then was given an honorary Yale degree. He was, a year later, offered an honorary degree from Harvard and said no, it was too much of a bother to drive to Cambridge to get it. But we had Yale in common. He liked Yale, and I remember having him come down one winter when the Yale Symphony was going to perform the orchestral suite for the movie, 1920 movie version of Der Rosenkavalier. Something that hadn't been done in years. And Maria Yeritza was there in a big hat, and Leonard Bernstein. It was a snowy evening. Jimmy would come down and to see this because he hadn't seen this orchestra going. We had all these things in common, and we'd go back and forth. And if he was by himself, he'd want somebody to go to the opera with him or a play or something like that. I was always happy to oblige. I became a reader then of his work, and he would send me things like that. So that's a level of intimacy that certainly Stephen Yenser had with him more than anyone, I think. But I certainly was a part of that reading process for poems, and he was very good. And he was also a superb reader of things that I would send him of my own. He had he just could almost immediately pick up the soft brown spots in the pear. And suggest they be cut. Later on, then, when he got sick, or had been sick with AIDS for a while, he called me over one day and asked if I would cover for him and in the public eye.
You were not aware of his diagnosis?
I was not. It took me all by surprise. And because he wanted to keep on working, and he didn't want to become an object of morbid curiosity or a poster boy for anything. He wanted to keep working. And so I spent a lot of time doing research on medical research for him. I kept a log of what his medicines were and how they were working. But he had always said that he was someone who wanted to just turn his head to the wall when, if he was seriously sick. He was not interested in pursuing anything to stay alive longer than he could. That was depressing to me, that he lacked a kind of energy to want to save himself, as it seemed in those days. He got right to the cusp when medicines were actually helped people live with AIDS as a chronic disease rather than as a death sentence. And I was angry at him, really, for not pursuing it. But I kept that up and, tried to see him through to the end. I made sure that he always had. I went down to Key West one winter just to take care of him. He was in the middle of a balmy winter. He was freezing cold. But I would take him to the gym and, get food for him and whatnot. And towards the very end, just tried to help him as well, although he died out west. Then I just did what I could from a distance and arranged his funeral and arranged memorial services and whatnot for quite some time afterwards, continually lying to reporters about the cause of his death. I mean, he had died of a heart attack, and at the same age as his father. I just didn't ever say what had led up to the heart attack or what contributed to it. His mother was still alive, and I think he was worried about her. David, his lover Peter Hooton, who had an acting career. He may have been wanting to protect him. Who knows? But he wanted to be by himself in the greatest moment of his life, that is to say, his death. And But his funeral here in Stonington, in the little church, little white church that looked rather Greek-like in its white interior, everybody came, and we put his ashes in the Stonington Cemetery here. David's eventually beside him, though he lived a few more forlorn years. Even his mother lived to 101 or 102, something like that. And proud of her son more in death than she sometimes was in life. So it was a friendship like none other in my life. And it was interesting to see a friend through from the height of his powers to his death, and watch his career, just rocket. And he was aware that many people disliked his work. It didn't bother him in the slightest. He didn't like people always beginning their reviews with, "He's the son of Merrill Lynch." I think he resented the fact that they would never let that go, and was hurt by the fact that it would be used against him. He had never taken much advantage of his wealth. He lived in very simple homes and, didn't flaunt it in any way, and gave so much money from it away to others. But he was always aware of his background and his luck, I think, in having a chance to do what he did better than anybody else.